Okay, hi everyone. This is the second video tutorial for this week. The first tutorial was a follow-up video to the external video that I suggested, which is the classic bouncing ball animation, which is a great introduction for anyone who hasn't done any keyframing animation before. And my video shows you just how to render out that animation into a frame sequence, which can then be compiled into a video. In this tutorial, we're doing something quite different. Rather than getting you to 3D model something from scratch, I'm providing you with this whole scene that I've made for you as sort of a template that you can use to practice making an animation. So in the bouncing ball tutorial, it shows you how to keyframe basic properties. In that video, it shows you keyframing, I believe, the position of the bone that controls the ball, as well as the rotation and location of the ball. In this case, I'm going to show you how this scene is set up, and then just point out to you that almost every aspect of this scene can be animated, and then I'm going to leave it up to you to make whatever you want. And for this exercise, I want you just to use this as a canvas to make your own animation. Okay, so the first thing I would advise you to do is just save a second copy of the scene. You might want to keep my original file just in case you really break something. So go into the project files folder and just call it like class 5 animation scene 2 or something like that, just so if you ever want to start again, you've got the original there. So now, for the rest of the video, I'm just going to explain to you a whole bunch of features of how this scene works, and then I want you to think about what you can do with it. So what the scene is, if I just pop out to preview, I kind of just took a bit of inspiration from a couple of sources that I think were relevant to the tutorial this week. This is a computer game called Transistor, came out a few years ago, and it uses isometric space. It's a role-playing game. And I also took a structural kind of inspiration from this scroll by Qiao Ying from the Ming Dynasty. So this is sort of the look that I was just playing around with. And actually, this image here that I use for the background is actually a screenshot from one of the transition sequences from Transistor. Okay, so back into Blender, let's have a look at how the scene works. So the first thing we'll start with is the camera. So because this week we're looking at parallel spaces, I've set up a parallel projection scene, in this case a kind of scrolling space. So if we go into the animation tab, you can see the camera view here, and the first thing you'll notice is that we have this parallel projection. It's not a regular perspective space. And that's simply because I'll open up the camera group here, and I'll go through this in a moment, but I've grouped everything into different categories, which here are called collections, but there's a sort of a logic behind that. So if you go into the camera and look at its settings down here, you can see I've set it to orthographic, and that's what's giving us this parallel space. By contrast, the viewport will be giving us a perspectival space. You can see how if you join this and this line here, they would join up in a vanishing point, whereas here, all of our parallel lines remain parallel. So there's no vanishing point, and therefore we have this scroll type space. The other thing, with this background, I'll show you what's going on. And I'll just make this window a little larger, and I'll close this down a bit. The background image is just sitting here, and it's actually parented, and we'll get into this a little bit later in the course. It's parented to the camera here, and you can see that in the scene collection, that the camera is here and the plane is sort of underneath it in the hierarchy. And what that means is that if I move the camera, I'll press G and Y, that all of the movements and transformations of the camera are copied or inherited by the background image. But for us, what that actually does is it gives us the appearance of the architecture and everything else moving and the sky staying the same. even though it's actually the camera that's moving and everything else is not moving. So that's just a nice little trick. And it also works for rotation. If I rotate the camera on the y-axis, the background also doesn't move and just allows us to change the viewpoint of the camera. Another thing we can do, which is up to you if you want to render out your image as an isometric projection rather than oblique projection. If I change the rotation of the camera to something like probably about 60, and then have a look at what that's done to the camera view over here, you can see that now we're getting something closer to isometric projection. Another thing we can do is, I'll go into this in a moment, but all of the architecture is made using modifiers. So that means that it's very, very flexible in how it functions. So if I click on the ground plane here, the third modifier, if I turn this up, will extend it in the background, and I've put another modifier here that's currently inactive. If I turn that on, that will extend the ground into the foreground. So if you want to create a sort of isometric, real-time strategy game type of space, something closer to what's in the game Transistor as well, you can just rotate the camera and extend these modifiers such that the ground plane is wider. Okay, I'll just set the rotation of the camera. Make sure I've got the camera selected. I'll set the rotation of the camera back to 90. Okay, so what else do we have to look at? Okay, so let's have a look at the architecture of the space itself. So I'll go into the modeling tab, just so we've got a bit more space to work with. Okay, so the other thing I'd like you to do is make sure you're on using Eevee renderer. Because we're not working in the computer lab and we're all using our own computers, we're going to use Eevee rendering for now because it's much, much faster than Cycles. Okay, so I'll go into rendered mode so you can see everything in this scene. So as well as there being this background image, I've also put in this sky dome texture, and what that's actually doing, we can't see it in our scene because I'm using this background, but it's giving some indirect lighting. And if you want to change that lighting, I've set it quite low, so we've got this sort of, I don't know, vaporwave, we're in space, but there's a little bit of light coming from a star sort of look. So I've set that quite low, but if you want to brighten up the environment, if you look in the World tab, you'll find that skybox that I've set up, and just scroll down and you can set the strength. If I put this to 1, it'll look much more like daytime rather than that twilight look that I wanted. Set that back to 0.4. Another thing you can do is if you want to simply render out the architecture and have a completely transparent background, you can, as I mentioned in the bouncing ball tutorial, you can go into the film tab, tick transparent, and then also hide the background image, which is in the camera group here. If I open up the camera, now if I hide it here, if I hide this plane, that won't have actually hidden it from the render. To hide it from the render, we'd actually have to go into the filters here, turn on the disable in renders filter, and that's a really useful one. That's just, instead of just having the eyeball here, now we've got this little picture of a camera. Now if I turn off the camera and the eyeball means you can see it in the viewport, but the camera means you can see it in the render. So if you've ever got objects turning up in your scene and you think, oh, where's that come from? Turn on the display in render toggle and just check that you might have hidden something in the viewport but not hidden it in the render. Okay, I'll leave that on and I'll turn my sky back on. Okay, so I'll just collapse these hierarchies a bit. I got a little distracted there. We were going to talk about how the architecture functioned. Okay, so the architecture is all made out of modifiers in the same way that we've been working so far. So I believe one of these squares here, if I press tab, this is our original square platform. And what that means is, of course, if you want to make any changes to the ground, of course you can. If you want to grab some of these squares and extrude them up, EZ, extrude them up like this, immediately you'll have made a change to the space. And so that's something that is absolutely you're welcome to do. And I encourage you guys to make as many changes to this scene as you want. I certainly don't want to see the exact same scene rendered every time. Probably be a bit boring. But let's go into the modifiers, because what I want to show you is that a lot of the properties in modifiers, I mean a lot of the properties in many of the component menus of Blender can be animated exactly the same way that you set keyframes into the position of the ball. You can set keyframes into all sorts of other parameters in Blender. So for example, if we look in the modifiers of the floor here, you know, I don't know visually if you can think of anything to do with this, but this count property here that is, not doing anything because that's the wrong modifier. This count property here that's set to 3, you know, if we set this down 2 and 1 and the floor is getting smaller and smaller, if you right click on that count, you could insert a keyframe there, which would mean that, for example, if we were in the animation window, so I've got a timeline here. Oh no, I don't have my timeline there. Where's my timeline? Timeline here. You know, if you were in this modifier and you wanted to have the floor, I don't know, for some reason get larger or disappear, you could add a keyframe here just like you could add a keyframe onto anything else. And there you go. You've got a keyframe on that parameter. But there's probably some other things that might be also more interesting to add keyframes to. So let's have a look. So the boxes here are also made using using arrays. This is, you know, very, very simple. I've got the count of the arrays here set to 5. That's why there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 platforms. And again, anything you'd like, if you want to change these boxes, you know, you can have one change affect all of the boxes. And you can also keyframe the offset. You know, this offset here is controlling the distance between all of these boxes, and if you right click there, you can insert a keyframe into this parameter. Okay, what's next on my list? Right, this little patterned element here that I've added in. Now the way that this is set up, I think that's in the objects. Oh no, that's probably in the architecture collection. Okay, pattern cube original, and I've got empty pattern offset. So what I've done is I've got an array on this object and I'm using an empty to control this spiral pattern, and then I've got another another array controlling the distribution of this pattern along the boxes. Now, if we, what I might do, I might just grab and move this little block so you can see what's going on. Oh, hold on. If I press G and grab, you'll see that this this little box is actually parented to this empty here, and you know, you could do all sorts of things with turning this into some sort of, you know, animated strange movement if you wanted to. And again, just, you know, have a look through the way it's working and play with whatever parameters of it that you like. And the final thing I'll show you in the architecture is, you know, same thing again. If I press tab here, you can see that this is actually just quite a small block of architecture. So any changes you want to make can be inherited across the array. Yeah, I think that's all pretty straightforward. Okay, so that's the architecture. Oh, actually, let's just have a look at the shading setup of all the architecture. It's all pretty much the same. If I go into the shading menu, it looks a little bit complicated, but it's pretty simple. What I've done to make your renders look a little bit better, I've done something called baking the ambient occlusion. And ambient occlusion, see how there are these shadows here? Maybe I can show you a little bit better if I turn off that texture. Okay, so now that the concrete texture has been turned off, you should see that what's actually going on here is there's just this very slight shadows and darkness here, and I think we looked at that when we were doing the cycles rendering last week, where cycles did that ray tracing calculation. So what I've done is I've done what's called baked that ray tracing calculation onto the texture of the building so that we can render in Eevee nice and quickly, but still get some of that nice shading. But so basically what's going on with this shader is that we have the ambient occlusion texture here, which if you check where it is, it's in the textures folder. So in the previous video I spoke about, in the previous video I spoke about setting up your correct folder hierarchy, and I've repeated that in this video. So in the textures folder, I've got these ambient occlusion baked images which are giving that little bit of shading, and then I've just got these concrete images which are giving the concrete texture. So in the shaders they're all pretty much the same. We've got the ambient occlusion baked image going in here, and I've added this brightness and contrast node in case it's not bright enough for you. You can turn these up or make them darker or whatever. And same with the contrast, you can have a play around with them as well. That's another parameter you could keyframe. If you wanted these to all do weird things, like if you turn the contrast into negative, you'll start getting these nice, odd, interesting effects. And if you right click on there, you can also insert a keyframe into parameters on the shader. And then I've got the concrete texture going in here into a mix node, and that mix node is just combining the shading with that color texture. And then I've set up a normal map that's also just giving a bit of that concrete texture. So if you click on the ground or the background area with the pillars, they've all got the same stuff going on. Okay, so what's the next thing we can look at? Let's have a look at this blob. This is just a bit of fun, really. What I might do is I'll turn on the so you can see the tools. The fun thing about this blob is that if I move it, it changes its shape. And that's just a little trick I've done using some modifiers. So if you have a look at its modifiers, I'll get rid of this shading menu, we don't really need to see that. And I'll expand this out. Oop. Grab that correctly. Okay, so if we have a look at the modifiers, the first one is I've put some subdivisions on. If I take the subdivisions off, you'll see that the shape doesn't have enough detail to kind of do that interesting warping. So I've given it a little bit more detail. Now if you make these numbers too high, that will slow down your render a bit. And if your render frames start going too slow, you'll very quickly find that to make even a 1 minute animation will all of a sudden take your computer a very long time. The next modifier is this displacement. And all I've done is I've set the texture coordinates to global. So what that means is that when it's applying the texture to the shape, as the shape changes its position in the global space, the displacement modifier is affecting the shape in a different way. And it gives us this kind of beautiful appearance of this blob, transforming through space. The other thing I've done is I've made this sort of glassy texture for it. Maybe when we do some more classes on texturing, I'll show you exactly how that works. But for now, you can just have a play with it. Have a play with some of its parameters here, and you might get to see sort of how it's working. The roughness, if you turn that down, it will change the degree to which the glass is sort of reflective, and the other one is the transmission, which is giving it that, I think that translucency, I think that's what it does. And in the shader settings down here, I think there's one other setting that's a bit of fun, is the screen space refraction, that's what has to be turned on in order to get that sort of glassy effect where we can see through it. But you can change the refraction depth. So if I put that up to 2, what that's doing is that the way that the world is being warped through the glass also changes. So that's another parameter you can play with. What next do we have? Let's have a look. Okay, let's have a look at these platforms of blocks. So these platforms of blocks are another just little creation. What's happening with these blocks is that you notice that every single composition of these blocks is different. The arrangement of the blocks is different on every one. And I haven't placed the blocks there. I've just, done another thing with modifiers, in this case a particle effect, and I've randomly told the computer to make a combination of these different shapes, which are actually sitting over here outside the scene, and I've told it to make a new little random composition every time. If you go down into now where should this be? I think in our platform clusters, if we look at our modifiers here, we've got this particle settings modifier, and if I go into its settings, I believe if you change the seed number, if you change the seed number, it will give you a different composition of blocks. If you change the number, it'll change the number of blocks that are on the platform, etc., etc., etc. So, have a play with those and see if changing these parameters, gives you something interesting to work with. What else do we have in the scene? Okay, another thing we've got is, you'll recognize our old friend from last week, the 4-dimensional hypercube, or the sort of fake hypercube. If I go into the, where's my timeline? And I press play, you'll see that we've got the animation of the hypercube running there. Now, in the bouncing ball video, it shows you how to loop that animation. And remember, if you wanted to cycle or loop this animation, you'd have to apply that to each of, I guess we haven't gone into how this functions, but the animation in the hypercube, which I believe is in the objects collection, hypercube empty, open that up. All of these empties here are what's driving this animation, and you'd have to cycle all of these if you wanted them to animate forever. If you want to move the hypercube, I've parented the hypercube to this single empty here, so you can just move it normally without affecting the animations. So that means you can have the hypercube sort of, if you keyframed its position at frame 1, I'll press N. If you keyframed its location on the y-axis here, inserted a keyframe, and then on frame 50, and I'll make this location go up here, and I'll insert, I should insert single keyframe. Then that should make our hypercube sort of move through space like a jellyfish or something, I don't know. I'll just clear those keyframes. Okay, what else have we got in the scene for you to play with? Another thing is there is a light. Oh yeah, there's a light underneath each of the platforms. It's called an area light. So if I go into rendered mode, Z and rendered, you can see that light. Now that's what's giving the glow coming from underneath the platform. If you go into the lights collection here, you'll see all of these area lights. Now if you go down to its settings here, you can see it's got its brightness and its color, both of which also can be keyframed. So you might want to change, you could have the brightness of the light, if I set this to 4000, it's probably going to be very bright. You could keyframe the power of the light going up and down. That would give you a sort of a pulsating light. There's really all sorts of different changes that I'd love you to experiment with making in this scene. Okay, I think that's probably about it. The last thing I'll show you is I'll just go back to the animation tab, and just to remind you that when you go to render your scene, start with something small. You know, maybe something like if our actually, let's make sure we're set at 30 frames per second. If we're set to 30 frames per second, let's say I'll set the frame range exactly in class, but for the sake of right now, if it was going to be a 20-second animation, then 600 is perfect. And make sure you get the basic things. Set your file format to PNG with RGB alpha. Make sure you set your render path to now we should be in the set your render path to the render frames folder, and have your frame set at the correct number. And to just test one frame, let's just have a look at that now. If we go render image, just give the computer a moment. Okay, there's our frame. Looks nice. And so if we wanted to render the entire frame range out, we'd say render and render animation. Okay, so that's probably enough for this tutorial. As I said, what I'd like you to do is just treat this scene that I've given you as a very basic building block that is there for you to play with, and make as many changes as you want. You can add new things into it. You can add in, bouncing balls or whatever it is you want to do. But this is really just a little playground for you guys to make some animations, and using the things that I put in there as just a starting point or some inspiration. Okay, thanks a lot, guys. Talk to you soon.